Angry misogynist yells at elderly woman, then discovers her son is the mayor. The city buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Honking cars filled the air, commuters rushed to work, and vendors set up their stalls on the busy sidewalks. Among the crowd was Margaret Hollis, a petite elderly woman with a kind smile and an unassuming demeanor. Dressed in her signature blue cardigan and carrying a reusable grocery bag, she walked down the street toward her favorite bakery. It was her daily ritual, a quiet moment in the bustling city. Margaret was known in the neighborhood. She often stopped to chat with shopkeepers, help struggling young mothers, or drop a few coins in the cups of the homeless she passed. Her warmth was a comforting presence amid the city's rough edges. But not everyone appreciated her kindness. That morning, as she paused at a crosswalk, Margaret saw a man ahead yelling at a street vendor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and red-faced with anger. His voice cut through the noise of the street like a blade. "You call this coffee? It's cold. Are you even paying attention to what you're doing?" he barked at the young vendor, who stammered an apology. Margaret frowned. She didn't like seeing people treated unfairly, and her instinct was always to step in. But as she approached, the man stormed off, clutching his cup of coffee and muttering curses under his breath. She hoped the incident was over, but she didn't realize it was just the beginning. Frank Dalton prided himself on being a man's man. He was a contractor who owned a small construction business, and while his work paid the bills, he carried a deep resentment for how his life had turned out. Divorced, estranged from his adult children, and bitter about his financial struggles, Frank had developed a cynical view of the world. In his mind, people were either obstacles or tools, and he made no effort to hide his disdain for those he deemed weak. He muttered under his breath as he walked down the street, the cold coffee adding to his already sour mood. "Incompetent people everywhere," he growled. "Can't even do a simple job." When he saw Margaret crossing the street at a leisurely pace, her grocery bag swinging lightly by her side, something about her calm demeanor annoyed him. It wasn't rational. She was just an old woman minding her own business. But in his eyes, she was another example of someone slowing him down. "Hurry it up, lady," he snapped as he approached. "Some of us have places to be." Margaret turned, startled by the harshness of his tone. She stepped aside to let him pass, offering a polite, "I'm sorry." But Frank wasn't satisfied. He stopped in front of her, his towering frame casting a shadow over her small figure. "You people think the world owes you something," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Walking around like you own the place, getting in everyone's way." Margaret blinked, taken aback. "But I didn't mean to." "Save it," Frank interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "People like you are the problem. No respect for anyone else's time or effort." A small crowd had started to gather, their murmurs of discomfort growing louder. A young man with a backpack stepped forward. "Hey man, leave her alone. She's not doing anything to you." Frank turned on him, his glare sharp. "Mind your own business, kid." Margaret raised a hand, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Please, let's not escalate this. I'm sure we can all go on our way." But Frank wasn't done. The bitterness that had been simmering inside him for years spilled out like poison. "You think you're some kind of saint, huh? Walking around, acting all high and mighty. Newsflash, lady, you're just a burden like the rest of them." The young man stepped closer, his fists clenched. "That's enough." Margaret touched his arm gently, stopping him. "It's all right," she said softly. "Thank you, but I can handle this." Frank smirked, mistaking her composure for weakness. "Yeah, run along, kid. Let the grown-ups talk." Margaret took a deep breath, meeting Frank's gaze with quiet strength. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said. "But the world is hard enough without us tearing each other down." Her words seemed to strike a nerve. Frank scowled, his face reddening. "Spare me the lecture," he snapped before storming off, shoving past the onlookers. The incident might have ended there if not for a chance encounter later that day. Frank was sitting in a diner, flipping through his phone and sipping another cup of coffee, when the news came on the TV mounted in the corner. The screen showed a press conference outside City Hall, where Mayor Jacob Hollis was addressing reporters. Frank barely paid attention until he caught sight of a familiar face standing beside the mayor, Margaret. his brow furrowed as he turned up the volume. The reporter's voice narrated, Mayor Hollis, joined by his mother, Margaret Hollis, spoke today about the city's new initiative to support low-income families and improve access to public services. Frank's jaw dropped as realization hit him. The woman he had berated on the street wasn't just any elderly woman. She was the mother of the mayor. The camera zoomed in on Margaret as she spoke at the podium, her voice calm and assured. It's easy to forget that everyone we meet is carrying a burden we may not see, she said. But compassion and kindness can make all the difference. Frank felt a wave of embarrassment and anger. His mind raced as he thought about the scene he had caused. Had anyone recorded it? Would it get back to the mayor? His heart sank at the thought of the potential consequences. The following morning, Frank received a call from one of his biggest clients, a developer he had worked with for years. The voice on the other end was curt. Frank, we need to talk. What's this about? Frank asked, his stomach tightening. There's a video going around, the client said. It shows you yelling at an elderly woman in public. Do you know who she is? Frank's blood ran cold. I didn't know at the time. Well, now you do, the client said sharply. She's the mayor's mother. And let me tell you, it's not a good look for us to be associated with someone who disrespects people like that. I can explain, Frank stammered. It was a misunderstanding. The client sighed. Maybe, but perception is reality. We can't afford the bad press. I'm sorry, Frank, but we're going to have to reconsider our relationship. The call ended before Frank could respond. He stared at his phone, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. In his anger and arrogance, he had burned bridges he couldn't afford to lose. Desperate to make amends, Frank decided to apologize to Margaret. He found out where she volunteered, a community center in one of the city's poorer neighborhoods, and showed up unannounced. As he walked through the doors, the cheerful chatter of children and the hum of activity made him feel out of place. Margaret was in the corner, helping a group of kids with an arts and crafts project. When she saw Frank approach, her expression shifted from surprise to curiosity. Mr. Dalton, isn't it? She said, her tone polite but guarded. Frank cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say. Mrs. Hollis, I need to apologize for the way I spoke to you. I didn't know who you were. Margaret raised an eyebrow. And would it have made a difference if you did? Frank hesitated, the weight of her question hanging in the air. I suppose it shouldn't have, he admitted. But I let my anger get the better of me. It wasn't right. Margaret studied him for a moment, then nodded. Apology accepted. But I hope you'll take this as a lesson, not just about how you treat me, but how you treat everyone. Frank nodded, his shame deepening. I will, he said. I promise. As Frank left the community center, he felt a strange mix of relief and regret. He knew it would take more than an apology to change the course of his life, but for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time, the desire to be better. After Frank's apology to Margaret at the community center, he couldn't shake the lingering guilt and embarrassment. His outburst on the street, which he had initially justified to himself as a moment of frustration, now felt like a glaring reflection of the bitterness he had allowed to take over his life. Margaret's calm demeanor and grace had disarmed him in a way he wasn't prepared for. And the question she had posed, whether it should have mattered who she was, stuck with him. In the days that followed, Frank found himself replaying the incident in his mind. He also couldn't ignore the fallout it had caused. Losing his biggest client was a blow to his business, and the video of the altercation had spread farther than he'd realized. People in his professional circles began to avoid him, reluctant to associate with someone who had gained such negative attention. For the first time in years, Frank felt truly isolated. But instead of lashing out as he usually did, he began to reflect. One evening, he sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The video of his confrontation with Margaret appeared again in his feed, shared by someone he didn't even know. Beneath it were hundreds of comments, many of them criticizing his behavior. Frank winced as he read them, but one comment caught his attention. It's easy to write people off, but maybe this guy needs a chance to change. Let's hope he takes it. The words lingered in his mind. Did he deserve another chance? And if so, what would he do with it? A week later, Frank decided to return to the community center. This time, he wasn't there to apologize, he was there to help. He had learned that Margaret volunteered regularly, organizing activities for kids and assisting with donations for struggling families. Frank wasn't sure if he would be welcome, but he knew he had to try. As he entered the bustling center, he spotted Margaret unpacking boxes of food donations in the corner. She glanced up, surprised to see him again. "Mr. Dalton," she said, setting down a can of soup. "What brings you back?" Frank cleared his throat, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. "I wanted to see if I could help. I have some free time, and, well, I figured it's the least I could do." Margaret studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled. "We can always use an extra pair of hands." She handed him a clipboard with a list of tasks, and Frank got to work. At first, he felt out of place among the cheerful volunteers and families who frequented the center. But as the hours passed, he began to feel a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. Over the next few weeks, Frank became a regular at the community center. He helped organize food drives, repaired broken furniture, and even painted a mural in the children's playroom. Slowly but surely, he began to shed the anger and cynicism that had defined him for so long. Margaret watched his transformation with quiet encouragement. She didn't press him about his past or the reasons for his change. She simply treated him with the same kindness and respect she showed everyone else. And in doing so, she taught him an important lesson, that redemption wasn't about erasing your mistakes, but about choosing to do better moving forward. One afternoon, as they were sorting clothing donations, Margaret struck up a conversation. "You've been coming here a lot lately," she said, folding a sweater. "What made you decide to stay?" Frank paused, considering her question. "Honestly, at first it was guilt. I felt like I owed it to you, and to myself, to make up for what I did. And now?" Margaret asked, her eyes warm but curious. Frank smiled faintly. "Now, I realize how much I needed this. Helping people, it gives me a sense of purpose I haven't felt in a long time." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, it's the hardest moments in our lives that lead us to where we're meant to be." Her words struck a chord with Frank. He thought about his failed marriage, his estranged children, and the years he had spent consumed by bitterness. For the first time, he began to see those experiences not as failures, but as opportunities to grow. As Frank became more involved in the community center, he began to rebuild his reputation. Local businesses took notice of his efforts, and some even reached out to offer him new projects. His construction skills proved invaluable, and he started taking on pro bono work to help renovate homes for families in need. The change in Frank's demeanor was undeniable. He no longer lashed out at the smallest inconveniences or viewed others with suspicion. Instead, he approached life with humility and a willingness to connect with people in meaningful ways. One day, Margaret invited Frank to join her at a city hall event. Mayor Jacob Hollis was announcing a new initiative to expand funding for community programs, and Margaret thought Frank might find it inspiring. As they arrived at the event, Frank couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness. He had avoided any direct interaction with the mayor since the incident, unsure of how he would be received. But when Jacob spotted Frank in the crowd, he approached with a warm smile. "Frank Dalton," Jacob said, extending a hand. "My mother's told me a lot about the work you've been doing at the center. I'm glad you're here." Frank shook his hand, taken aback by the mayor's kindness. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." Jacob chuckled. "You can thank my mother. She has a knack for seeing the best in people." Frank glanced at Margaret, who smiled knowingly. "She certainly does," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. The event marked a turning point for Frank. With Margaret's encouragement and Jacob's support, he began advocating for community programs on a larger scale. He spoke at town hall meetings, sharing his own story as an example of how compassion and opportunity could change lives. His journey from an angry, bitter man to a dedicated volunteer and advocate resonated with people, inspiring others to get involved. Years later, Frank stood in front of a newly renovated community center, surrounded by families, volunteers, and city officials. The building, once in disrepair, had been transformed into a vibrant hub of activity thanks to the efforts of Frank and countless others. As he cut the ribbon to officially reopen the center, Frank felt a surge of pride and gratitude. He spotted Margaret in the crowd, her smile as warm as ever, and gave her a small nod. After the ceremony, Margaret approached him, her eyes shining. "You've come a long way, Mr. Dalton," she said. Frank chuckled. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Hollis. You didn't just change my life, you saved it." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "You saved yourself, Frank. I just gave you a little push." From that day forward, Frank continued his work in the community, driven by a sense of purpose and a desire to give back. His journey wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt and struggle, but he faced them with the resilience he had gained through his experiences. And as he looked around the bustling community center, filled with laughter, hope, and connection, Frank knew he had finally found the life he was meant to lead. Frank's transformation wasn't just something that affected his life. It became a ripple that reached far and wide. The community center flourished under his involvement, and his story began to inspire others in the city who had once been weighed down by their own anger or hopelessness. People who had seen the video of his outburst against Margaret were now seeing a very different man. A man who had learned, grown, and chosen a better path. One spring afternoon, Frank was working on a new project at the community center, a small garden space for the children to learn about plants and sustainability. He wiped sweat from his brow as he adjusted the trellis, then turned to see Margaret approaching with a tray of lemonade. Even at her age, she was tirelessly active, her energy and warmth radiating with every step. "You've been at it all day," she said, handing him a glass. "Take a break." Frank smiled, gratefully accepting the drink. "I guess I don't know when to quit," he said, chuckling. Margaret sat down on the nearby bench, her gaze drifting to the flowers beginning to bloom around them. "It's amazing, isn't it? How much can grow when you give it the right care and attention?" Frank followed her gaze, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "I never thought I'd be someone who could grow anything," he admitted. "For a long time, I just felt stuck, angry at everything and everyone. I didn't know how to fix it." Margaret looked at him, her expression kind but firm. "Sometimes we can't fix it alone. That's why we need each other, to remind us of who we can be, even when we forget." Frank nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "You've done that for me, and I'll never be able to thank you enough." Margaret reached over, patting his hand. "You've already thanked me, Frank. Every time you show up here, every time you help someone, every time you choose kindness, you're saying thank you." As the garden project neared completion, Frank received an unexpected invitation. Mayor Jacob Hollis had invited him to speak at an upcoming citywide forum on community building and rehabilitation programs. Frank was surprised, unsure if he was the right person for such a public event. "You've got a powerful story to tell," Jacob said when they met to discuss the forum. "People need to hear it. You're living proof that change is possible." Frank hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the best example. I've made a lot of mistakes." "That's exactly why you're the best example," Jacob said. "None of us are perfect, Frank. What matters is what we do after the mistakes. And you've done more than most." Encouraged by Jacob and Margaret, Frank agreed to speak. The weeks leading up to the forum were nerve-wracking as he prepared his speech, but he knew this was an opportunity to make a difference. The day of the forum arrived, and the large auditorium was packed with community leaders, activists, and residents eager to hear from the speakers. Frank sat backstage, his hands clasped tightly as he ran through his notes one last time. Margaret found him just before he went on, her presence instantly calming. "You're going to do great," she said. "Just speak from the heart." Frank nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thanks, Margaret. I wouldn't even be here if it weren't for you." When it was his turn, Frank walked onto the stage to a round of polite applause. He gripped the podium, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Margaret, who smiled encouragingly from the front row. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "My name is Frank Dalton, and for most of my life, I didn't think I was someone who could stand here in front of you today." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was angry. At the world, at myself, at everything. I let that anger drive my actions, and it cost me more than I realized. My relationships, my reputation, and my sense of purpose. Frank shared the story of his confrontation with Margaret, admitting to his faults and the shame he felt afterward. That moment could have been the end of the story, he said. But instead, it was the beginning of something new. He spoke about his journey at the community center, the lessons he'd learned from Margaret, and the impact of choosing kindness and connection over anger and isolation. Change isn't easy, he said. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, and it takes time. But it's worth it. And if I can change, so can anyone. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. Frank stepped off the stage, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and pride. Margaret was waiting for him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You were wonderful," she said, giving him a hug. Frank smiled, his voice soft. "I just told the truth." Frank's speech at the forum marked another turning point in his life. His story resonated with people across the city, sparking conversations about redemption, forgiveness, and the importance of community. He was invited to speak at other events, sharing his journey and encouraging others to embrace change. At the same time, his work at the community center continued to grow. He led new projects, mentored young volunteers, and even started a program to teach construction skills to unemployed residents, helping them build careers and regain their confidence. The center became a second home for Frank, a place where he felt truly connected to others and to himself. It was no longer just about making amends, it was about creating a legacy of hope and transformation. One day, as Frank was helping a group of kids assemble birdhouses in the garden, he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was his daughter, Sarah, whom he hadn't seen in years. Frank froze, his heart racing. He had tried to reach out to his children after his divorce, but they had distanced themselves from him, unwilling to deal with his anger and bitterness. He had always hoped for a chance to reconcile, but he never expected it to happen here. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice tentative. "I heard you've been working here. I wanted to see for myself." Frank set down the hammer, his hands trembling. "Sarah, it's so good to see you." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "I saw your speech online," she said. I didn't know how much you'd changed." Frank swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said. "But I'm trying to make up for them. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be better, for you and your brother." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I can see that. I'd like to get to know this version of you." Frank's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and hope. "I'd like that too." As the weeks passed, Frank and Sarah began rebuilding their relationship, taking small but meaningful steps toward healing. She even brought her younger brother, Mark, to the community center one weekend, and the three of them spent the afternoon painting the garden fence together. For Frank, it was a dream he never thought would come true. The bitterness that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude for the second chances he had been given. Years later, at a celebration marking the community center's 20th anniversary, Frank stood once again in front of a crowd. This time, he wasn't nervous, he was proud. The center had become a cornerstone of the neighborhood, a place where lives were changed and dreams were nurtured. Margaret, now retired from her active volunteering but still a beloved figure in the community, sat in the front row with Jacob and Frank's children. As Frank spoke about the center's impact and the power of coming together, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. "We're all capable of change," he said. "And when we choose to lift each other up, there's no limit to what we can achieve." As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Frank looked out at the faces of the people who had become his family. Among them was Margaret, whose quiet strength had sparked his journey of redemption. Frank stepped down from the stage and walked over to her, kneeling beside her chair. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Margaret smiled, her hand resting on his. "You're the one who did the work, Frank. I just reminded you of what you already had inside." Frank nodded, his heart full. "You changed my life. And you've changed so many others," Margaret said. "That's the greatest gift of all." As the celebration continued, Frank stood with his children, watching the laughter and joy that filled the room. The man he had once been felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone he was proud to be. And as he looked around at the community he had helped build, he knew that his journey, though difficult, had been worth every step. Frank's journey of transformation continued to inspire those around him, but he never saw himself as a hero. He believed the real heroes were the people who showed up every day, volunteers, parents, teachers, and neighbors, working together to lift up their community. The community center had become a vibrant hub of hope and opportunity, but Frank knew there was always more to be done. One day, as he walked through the center's bustling hallways, he noticed a boy sitting alone in the corner of the cafeteria. The boy couldn't have been older than 12, his thin frame hunched over a tray of untouched food. His clothes were worn, his sneakers scuffed, and his eyes held a sadness that Frank recognized all too well. Frank approached slowly, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. "Hey there," he said gently. "What's your name?" The boy glanced up, wary but curious. "Leo," he mumbled. "Well, Leo," Frank said with a warm smile, "I'm Frank. You new here?" Leo nodded, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "My mom just brought us here last week. We had to leave where we were staying." Frank's heart ached at the boy's words. He had heard similar stories from countless families who came to the center, families displaced by financial hardships, evictions, or unsafe living situations. But each story was unique, and each one reminded him why this work mattered. "Your mom's doing what she needs to do to keep you safe," Frank said. "That's what parents do. And you've got a lot of people here who want to help." Leo looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "You work here?" Frank chuckled. "Something like that. I mostly help out with building things and fixing stuff. But if you ever need anything, someone to talk to, or just a place to hang out, you let me know, okay?" The boy nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay." As Frank walked away, he couldn't shake the thought of Leo sitting alone, carrying burdens no child should have to bear. He made a mental note to check in on him and his family, determined to ensure they had the support they needed. Over the next few weeks, Frank made it a point to spend time with Leo whenever he was at the center. He invited the boy to help with small projects, teaching him how to use tools and build simple structures. Leo quickly took to the tasks, his confidence growing with each new skill he learned. One afternoon, as they worked on assembling a set of shelves for the library, Leo opened up about his life. He told Frank about the nights spent sleeping in their car, the meals they sometimes had to skip, and the fear of not knowing where they would end up next. Frank listened intently, his heart breaking for the boy. But he also saw something else in Leo: resilience. Despite everything he had been through, the boy had a spark of determination that reminded Frank of himself as a child. "You're stronger than you realize, Leo," Frank said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "And no matter what happens, you've got people here who care about you." Leo looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Frank. You're like the dad I never had." The words hit Frank like a bolt of lightning. He had spent years estranged from his own children, believing he had failed them as a father. But hearing those words from Leo gave him a renewed sense of purpose, a chance to be the kind of role model he had once struggled to be. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to be a guiding presence in Frank's life. Though she had stepped back from her active volunteering role, she remained deeply involved in the center's mission, often attending events and offering her wisdom to those who sought her advice. One evening, as Frank walked Margaret to her car after a meeting, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You've done so much for this community, Frank. Have you ever thought about taking it further?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled. "You've become a leader here. People respect you, they look up to you. Have you ever considered running for office?" Frank stopped in his tracks, stunned by the suggestion. "Me? In politics?" "Margaret, I'm not exactly a polished public figure." "And that's exactly why you'd be perfect," Margaret said. "You're real, Frank. You understand what it's like to struggle, to fight for a better life. People need leaders who've walked in their shoes." Frank shook his head, overwhelmed by the idea. "I don't know, Margaret. I've made a lot of mistakes. I'm not sure people would trust me." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "Those mistakes don't define you. What defines you is what you've done since then. And I think you'd be surprised by how many people would believe in you." The idea of running for office stayed with Frank in the weeks that followed. At first, he dismissed it as impossible, but the more he thought about it, the more it began to feel like a natural extension of the work he was already doing. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: the people in his community deserved better. After discussing it with Margaret, Jacob, and his own children, Frank decided to take the leap. He announced his candidacy for a local council seat, running on a platform of community investment, affordable housing, and education reform. The campaign was a whirlwind of activity. Frank spent his days knocking on doors, attending town hall meetings, and sharing his story with anyone who would listen. At first, he faced skepticism. Some residents remembered the old Frank and questioned whether he had truly changed. But as they heard him speak and saw the passion in his eyes, many were won over. "I'm not a politician," Frank often said at rallies. "I'm just a man who knows what it's like to struggle. And I'm here to fight for the people who've been forgotten for too long." The election night was a tense affair. Frank and his team gathered at the community center, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters. As the results trickled in, the room buzzed with nervous anticipation. When the final results were announced, the room erupted into cheers. Frank had won the council seat by a narrow margin, a victory that felt like a triumph not just for him, but for the entire community. Margaret hugged him tightly, her eyes brimming with pride. "I told you," she said with a smile. "You're exactly what this community needs." Frank laughed, his voice choked with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, Margaret. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Frank's time on the council was marked by tireless advocacy for the people he represented. He pushed for policies that prioritized the needs of working families, expanded funding for community programs, and held corporations accountable for their impact on local neighborhoods. But Frank never forgot where he came from. He continued to spend time at the community center, mentoring kids like Leo and reminding himself of why he had started this journey in the first place. Leo, now a teenager, had grown into a confident and driven young man. With Frank's guidance, he had discovered a passion for carpentry and was even considering pursuing a career in construction. One day, as they worked side by side repairing a fence, Leo turned to Frank with a grin. "You know," he said, "if you ever run for mayor, I'll totally vote for you." Frank laughed, shaking his head. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, kid. One step at a time." But deep down, Frank knew that anything was possible. His life had been a testament to the power of second chances and the extraordinary things that could happen when people came together to lift each other up. Years later, as Frank stood at the grand opening of a new affordable housing complex, a project he had championed from the beginning, he looked out at the crowd gathered to celebrate. Among them were the faces of the people who had shaped his journey: Margaret, Jacob, Sarah, Mark, and Leo. Frank took a deep breath, his heart full of gratitude. "This isn't about one person," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's about all of us. It's about what we can achieve when we refuse to give up on each other. Together, we can build a future where everyone has a place to call home." The applause that followed was deafening, a powerful reminder of how far he had come. And as Frank looked out at the faces of the people he had come to love, he knew that his story was far from over. It was only just beginning. Frank's life continued to evolve as his work on the city council brought him into new challenges and opportunities. Every day presented a fresh test of his resolve and determination, and he found himself rising to the occasion with a strength he never thought he possessed. Yet, he never let his growing influence distance him from the community that had shaped him. Frank remained a constant presence at the community center, where his story had begun to turn around. One day, while walking through the neighborhood, Frank saw Leo, now a confident young man, coaching a group of kids on the basketball court. It was a surreal sight for Frank. This boy who had once sat silently in the corner of the cafeteria, unsure of his place in the world, now stood tall, inspiring others to believe in themselves. Frank approached as the game wrapped up, clapping his hands. "Looking good out there, Coach Leo," he called out. Leo turned, grinning as he jogged over. "Hey Frank, what brings you by?" "I had some time before my next meeting," Frank replied. "Thought I'd stop by and see how things were going." Leo wiped sweat from his forehead, his smile never fading. "The kids are great. They remind me of me when I first came here. Frank chuckled. And look at you now. You're their role model. Leo shrugged modestly, but his pride was evident. I just want to give back, you know? The way you and Margaret gave to me. Frank nodded, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. You're doing more than giving back, Leo. You're changing lives. Later that week, Frank found himself at a city council meeting that would test everything he had worked for. A wealthy developer had proposed a luxury condominium project in the heart of the neighborhood, a project that would displace dozens of low-income families and drastically increase property values, making the area unaffordable for many longtime residents. The developer's representatives stood before the council, delivering a polished presentation about the economic benefits of the project. They spoke of job creation, increased tax revenue, and the promise of modern amenities that would elevate the neighborhood. But Frank wasn't buying it. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and addressed the room with the same conviction that had won him the election. This neighborhood doesn't need luxury condos, he said firmly. What it needs is affordable housing, access to resources, and a commitment to the people who've called this place home for generations. The developer's representative attempted to counter his argument, but Frank didn't back down. He brought out testimonials from residents, data showing the negative impact of gentrification, and examples of successful community-driven development projects. The debate was intense, lasting well into the night. But when the vote was finally cast, Frank's side prevailed. The luxury condo project was rejected, and the council committed to exploring alternatives that prioritized the needs of the community. As Frank left the meeting, he was met with cheers and applause from a group of residents who had gathered outside. Among them was Margaret, her smile radiant with pride. "You did it, Frank," she said, hugging him tightly. "You stood up for what's right." Frank smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without everything you've taught me, Margaret. You're the reason I'm here." The victory solidified Frank's reputation as a champion for the people, and it reignited discussions about the importance of equitable development in the city. It wasn't long before Frank's name began circulating in conversations about higher political office. Some suggested he run for mayor, while others saw him as a potential candidate for state government. But Frank wasn't interested in climbing the political ladder for the sake of power or prestige. He cared deeply about the community he had grown to love, and he wanted to ensure that his work remained grounded in the realities of the people he served. One evening, as he sat in his modest office at the community center, Margaret stopped by for one of their regular chats. She noticed the thoughtful expression on his face and tilted her head. "What's on your mind, Frank?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. "People keep talking about me running for mayor," he admitted. "I'm not sure if it's the right move." Margaret smiled knowingly. "You've always followed your heart, Frank. That's what brought you here. What does your heart tell you?" He hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I want to keep making a difference, but I'm afraid of losing touch with the community if I go too far up the ladder." Margaret nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Then find a way to do both. Stay connected to the people, no matter what position you hold. The title doesn't matter as much as the impact you make." Frank considered her words, feeling a sense of clarity. "You always know what to say, don't you?" Margaret laughed softly. "I just remind you of what you already know." Months later, after much deliberation and encouragement from his family and supporters, Frank announced his candidacy for mayor. His campaign was built on the same principles that had guided his time on the council: compassion, community, and a commitment to lifting up those who had been left behind. The race was tough, with well-funded opponents who ran aggressive campaigns. But Frank's authenticity and grassroots support set him apart. He spent every day knocking on doors, attending community events, and listening to the concerns of residents. His story of redemption resonated deeply, and his message of hope inspired countless voters. On election night, Frank stood on a stage in front of a crowd of cheering supporters, his heart pounding as the results were announced. When his victory was confirmed, the crowd erupted into celebration, and Frank felt a surge of emotion unlike anything he had ever experienced. As he stepped up to the microphone, he looked out at the sea of faces, people from all walks of life who had come together to believe in a shared vision for their city. Among them were Margaret, Jacob, Leo, Sarah, Mark, and countless others who had played a role in his journey. "Thank you," Frank began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me, for believing in this community, and for believing in the power of change." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This victory isn't mine, it's ours. It belongs to every person who has fought for a better future, who has lifted up their neighbors, and who has refused to give up. Together, we've proven that anything is possible." The applause was deafening, and as Frank stepped back from the microphone, he felt Margaret's hand on his arm. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "You've come a long way, Frank," she said. "And I couldn't be prouder." Frank smiled, his heart full. "I wouldn't be here without you, Margaret. You're the one who showed me the way." She shook her head gently. "You found the way yourself. I just walked beside you." As Frank settled into his new role as mayor, he remained true to his roots. He continued to visit the community center regularly, meeting with residents and staying involved in the programs he had helped build. His administration focused on affordable housing, education, and public safety, with an emphasis on community-driven solutions. Leo, now a young adult, became one of Frank's closest allies, working as a coordinator for youth programs across the city. Frank often joked that Leo was the real leader, and the two shared a bond that felt more like family than mentorship. Margaret, though retired, remained an active presence in the community. She often attended city council meetings and public forums, her quiet strength and wisdom continuing to inspire everyone around her. Years later, as Frank stood in the newly renovated community center, a project he had overseen as one of his final acts as mayor, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From an angry, bitter man lashing out at the world to a leader who had found purpose and love in service, his life had been transformed in ways he never could have imagined. Margaret, now in her 90s, sat beside him, her hands resting on her cane. She looked around the bustling center, her eyes filled with pride. "You've built something incredible, Frank," she said softly. Frank smiled, his gaze warm. "We built it together, Margaret. All of us." As the sun set outside, casting a golden glow over the city, Frank felt a deep sense of peace. His story wasn't just about redemption, it was about the power of community, the strength of second chances, and the belief that even the most unlikely people could change the world. And as he looked out at the faces of the people who had become his family, Frank knew that the legacy they had built would endure for generations to come. Years after Frank's tenure as mayor, the community he had worked so hard to uplift faced an unexpected threat. A multinational corporation had announced plans to build a massive industrial complex just outside the city, citing the promise of jobs and economic growth. At first, the news seemed promising, new opportunities for residents struggling to make ends meet. But as details emerged, it became clear that the project would come at a steep cost. The industrial complex would pollute the local air and water, endangering the health of nearby communities. Worse, it threatened the very neighborhoods that Frank and his team had worked tirelessly to revitalize, with increased traffic, noise, and displacement looming on the horizon. Though Frank had officially retired from public office, his dedication to the community had never wavered. When news of the project broke, residents turned to him, desperate for guidance. At first, Frank hesitated. He was no longer in a position of authority, and part of him wondered if he still had the energy to take on such a monumental fight. But Margaret, now in her 90s and as sharp as ever, quickly put those doubts to rest. During one of their regular conversations, she leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Frank," she said firmly, "this community still needs you. You may not have a title anymore, but you have something far more powerful, the trust of the people. That's all you've ever needed." Her words reignited the fire within Frank. The next day, he called a meeting at the community center, which was packed with residents, activists, and local leaders. Standing at the front of the room, Frank felt the weight of their hope and fear. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "This isn't just about a factory," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "This is about the future of our community. About the air our children will breathe, the water they'll drink, and the neighborhoods we've fought so hard to protect. We've faced challenges before, and we've overcome them together. This time will be no different." The room erupted into applause, and the fight began. The battle against the corporation was grueling. Frank worked alongside environmental activists, legal experts, and community leaders to rally opposition. They organized protests, launched petitions, and flooded city council meetings with passionate testimonies. Frank, despite his age, was at the forefront of every effort, his energy fueled by a deep sense of responsibility. Leo, now a young leader in his own right, became Frank's right-hand man. Together, they worked tirelessly to educate residents about the dangers of the project and mobilize support. Leo's passion and charisma brought in a younger generation of activists, while Frank's experience and wisdom inspired the older residents to stay engaged. The corporation, however, was a formidable opponent. With nearly unlimited resources, they launched a PR campaign to paint the project as a boon for the city. They promised jobs, economic growth, and even charitable contributions to local schools and hospitals. Some residents, struggling to make ends meet, began to waver. Frank knew the stakes were high. He organized a town hall meeting, inviting both supporters and skeptics to hear the unfiltered truth. Standing before the crowd, he spoke from the heart. "I understand the appeal of what they're offering," he said, his voice heavy with empathy. "But we have to ask ourselves, at what cost? Jobs and money mean nothing if our health, our homes, and our future are destroyed. We've built something incredible here, and I won't let anyone take that away from us." The turning point came when Margaret, frail but still fiercely determined, took the stage. With a cane in one hand and a microphone in the other, she addressed the crowd with a quiet but undeniable authority. "I've lived a long life," she said, "and I've seen what happens when people give in to fear and greed. It tears communities apart. But I've also seen what happens when people stand together. And this community is worth fighting for." Her words brought the crowd to its feet, and the momentum shifted in their favor. The final showdown came during a public hearing where the city council would decide whether to approve the project. The corporation's lawyers and lobbyists made their case, presenting slick presentations and lofty promises. But when it was time for the community to speak, the room came alive with passion. Parents spoke of their fears for their children's health. Small business owners shared concerns about the impact on their livelihoods. And Frank, in one of the most powerful speeches of his life, reminded everyone of the values they had fought so hard to uphold. "This isn't just about stopping a factory," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about protecting our home. About proving that people, not corporations, have the power to shape their own future. We've done it before and we'll do it again." When the council finally voted, the room held its collective breath. And when the decision came down, a unanimous rejection of the project, the room erupted into cheers and tears of relief. In the days that followed, the victory was celebrated as a triumph of community over corporate greed. Frank, though exhausted, felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The fight had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of collective action. As he stood outside the community center, watching children play in the garden he had helped build years ago, Margaret joined him, her steps slow but steady. "You did it again, Frank," she said, her voice filled with pride. Frank smiled, his gaze on the bustling scene before them. "No, Margaret. We did it. Like always." She chuckled, leaning on her cane. "You're right. And as long as we keep standing together, there's nothing we can't do." The sun set over the neighborhood, casting a warm glow over the streets and homes they had fought so hard to protect. And as Frank stood there, surrounded by the people and the community he loved, he knew that their story, like their fight, was far from over. It was a testament to the strength of unity, the power of hope, and the belief that no matter how great the challenge, change was always possible when people refused to give up.